Well, welcome to another Wednesday night Bible study. We are continuing to work through the Gospel of John. We will begin with chapter 18 tonight. We're getting close to wrapping up this Gospel. My goal, given the different things we'll be doing throughout the summer, and some of the Wednesdays that we won't have Bible study, we'll have events instead, I really think we can finish the Gospel of John, but it will most likely take most of the Wednesday nights in the summer that we will have Bible study. So just giving you a heads up on that. We will begin tonight with chapter 18. As I just said, there are some Wednesdays during the summer that we won't meet for Bible study, and so we won't have the online Bible study that week as well. And so one of those is next week. Next week we will have a family movie night. We encourage our entire family to come and eat together. We'll be in the gym. We've done a movie night before where we did it out on the softball field, and given that we're already experiencing 100 plus heat indices and mammoth mosquitoes, we are going to move this in to the gym floor, and so inside the gym. And so next Wednesday night we won't have Bible study. We will have a family movie night, and so I encourage you to consider being a part of that and fellowshipping together as we do that together as a family. And so that will be coming up a week from today. So just know that next Wednesday that's what we will be doing. There's a Wednesday night in July that we'll all gather at the Hook Stadium for First Baptist Night at the Hooks. And so tickets are already available for that even now for $10 a piece. And so just know those are some things that are coming. We'll have a picnic towards the end of the summer. There's some things throughout the summer that Wednesday nights will be dedicated to some family event like that. So just wanted you to be aware of that. The other thing that I'll mention before we start into our Bible study is we have Vacation Bible School coming up the very last week of June. It will start on Monday and end on Friday. Friday actually July 2nd, so it's the very last week of June moving into July. We still have about 15 adult positions we need to fill. And so I encourage you to pray about that, to think about that, maybe talk among your friends and agree to do it together. But we need some help. This is one of the greatest outreach events, and we didn't get to do this last year. We were doing things differently, obviously, because of COVID, and so last year we didn't get to have an in-person Vacation Bible School. This will be an in-person Vacation Bible School on those mornings of that week. And so I really want to encourage you to consider and to pray about serving, even if it's just for a couple of days. If you could get someone to help you and you could do Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and someone else could do Thursday and Friday in your spot, we could make that work. We just need help. Most of these are what we call guides. There wouldn't be a lot of preparation. We have folks, most of our rooms and Bible studies and all the different activities the kids will experience, those things for the most part are covered. What we really need are what we call guides that just relate with the kids and get them from one place in the building to the next and be with that same group of kids throughout the morning. And so really, like I said, there's not much prep work. It's just showing up and being a shining light for Jesus for those kids and just walking with them, sitting with them, being with them, and not having to put a lot of work into being ready to do that. And so I want to encourage you to really consider that and pray about that and see if God would lead you to help in this great outreach that we have. We've got already 170 children registered, and that will grow, I'm sure, as we get closer to the time. And so just want to encourage you in that way to help us out there. All right, as I said, we will begin now in verse 1 of chapter 18. Let me give you just to get us back up to where we are now. And in chapter 17, we're still in that last evening before Jesus goes to the cross the next day. Either they are still in that upper room or in the process of going across to the Garden of Gethsemane, and that's where we pick up now But Jesus had just been in chapter 17. The entire chapter of chapter 17 was a prayer. Jesus' prayer for himself, that God would be glorified in him through what he was about to go through, and then his prayer for his disciples, and then for those who would come after his disciples, that would be products of his disciples, and that's us. Jesus prayed for each of those things in chapter 17. And so now we pick up in verse 1 of chapter 18. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" I want to stop there and go back and let's think through. I want to help you understand this picture. I've actually had the opportunity, the blessing, many, many years ago when I was in grad school, to take a trip to Israel and spend 6 weeks there on an archaeological dig, actually up in the northern country in Galilee, in a little area known in biblical times as Caesarea Philippi. But we did get to spend a considerable amount of time in the holy city in Jerusalem. And one of the most breathtaking memories that is etched in my heart and my mind is sitting in the garden. Many would suggest, and I don't know, I'm not a botanist, so I don't know that this is actually true, but I've heard it and read it, that there's a possibility that some of those olive trees may have been there even in the time of Jesus. But regardless of whether or not the actual tree that's there now was there 2,000 years ago, the point is, sitting in that garden, looking across that valley at the eastern wall of the Temple Mount and seeing nowadays the Dome of the Rock, but knowing that in Jesus' time that would have been the temple, Solomon's temple, standing there. And that picture of what was happening is just, like I said, it's something that I will never forget. And so when Jesus had finished praying this prayer that he prayed in chapter 17, he and his disciples left and crossed this Kidron Valley. It's there's another translation for the Kidron Valley. It's the valley between the cedars, or the brook of the cedars. It's a dry brook. There's no water in it normally, except after a rain. Obviously, with a valley, water will run through it. But what you see in this even today, and it would have been the same then, is outside that eastern wall are all these tombs. And the reason for that is there is a gate that's walled up, it's rocked up, but you can see the outline of the gate in that eastern wall, and that is called the Golden Gate. And even today, Hasidic Jews and folks who follow the Jewish religious system still believe that the Messiah, when the Messiah comes, will go through that Golden Gate into the holy city. And so when people died, they wanted to be buried near that Golden Gate so that when Messiah came, they would be the first to greet him and first to rise. So that is what you see when you go. You see this valley that comes off of the Mount of Olives and into the valley and back up to the Temple Mount, and all of these graves and the wall and the gate there. And Jesus and his disciples crossed that valley up onto this hillside, the Mount of Olives, and we're told here that they went into a garden that Jesus went to evidently fairly often. Now, in the other Gospels, Synoptic Gospels, this is named as the Garden of Gethsemane. It's not named that here. John didn't share that. But they went to the other side, and there was a garden, and he and his disciples went to it. Now, we know from the next verse, verse 2, Judas knew about it because they had gone there before. Jesus had often met, it says, and the word there met is gathered his disciples together. He had often gathered his disciples into this garden to pray and to teach And so this was a common place that they went when they were in Jerusalem or near Jerusalem. And so Judas would have known, and of course Judas had already left that upper room and that Passover meal to go out and do what he was going to do, and that was to betray Jesus. And so in verse 2 we see now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because they had often met there. Jesus had often gathered his disciples there to pray. So Judas came to the garden guiding a detachment. Now, before we move on, let me just say the synoptics also, as you know, go into more detail about what happened in the garden, with Jesus asking his disciples to pray, and then taking the three on a little farther and asking them to stay awake and pray, and then him going on a little farther to be alone, where he sweat the blood of the drops of sweat that were blood. I will say there's just to the south of this garden nowadays is a church that has been erected to commemorate this event, to commemorate that last night. And when you walk into that church, up where normally you would think of in our church a pulpit or a platform, there's an area that is roped off, and there's a rock there that is traditionally where Jesus leaned against that rock, and over that rock when he prayed and sweat those drops of blood. And so lots of history, lots of tradition, but still very meaningful when you're there. And so we don't get all of those details in John's account, but we do get them from the synoptics, where Jesus went a little farther and prayed and agonized over this cup, that God would take this cup from him, but then ultimately, not my will, but your will be done. And so that all has transpired, and now we find here in verse 3 that Judas has come to this garden guiding, it says, a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. Now, it says they were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. We know this was at night. It was dark. And so, I want to paint this picture, this image of the disciples and Jesus in this garden. And in the midst of their being in this garden, and at night, they can see across this valley and see the outline, the shadows of the temple. But to see this line of soldiers and officials coming with torches, Jesus knows why they're coming. He already knows what's going to happen. And so I want you to visualize what that scene must have been like, that they are there in the garden praying, and it's late at night, and many of the disciples are asleep, but across that valley comes those line of torches of men coming to arrest Jesus. And they're guided there by Judas because he knew that's where they would go. They went there often. And so they come, and we find out that they're soldiers, but they're also officials from the chief priest. We'll find as we move further into the story that Peter pulls a sword and cuts the ear off of the assistant or the helper of the chief priest. And so we know that these were temple officials. Now, just to the north end of the Temple Mount, there was a fortress, the Fortress Antonia. And not only were there Roman soldiers there, because they weren't allowed to really officiate, and Rome gave the Temple Mount basically the function of what was happening there to the Jewish people, to the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes. But just adjacent to that was a fortress. Now, some would say these were mostly temple police, and that may be, but we know that they were carrying weapons, and so there's different opinions on whether or not temple police were allowed to carry weapons or not. So most would say, and since John specifies soldiers and officials from the chief priests, that we have not only the Roman soldiers most likely, but also this temple police, those that had been sent out, if you remember, a few chapters before to capture Jesus, and then they actually began to listen to him and did nothing and went back to report, and the Pharisees got very upset and said, "Have you become his followers too?" So these same folks had come out, and what we're about to see is such a vivid picture of the weight that Jesus carried, the knowledge that these people had of who he really was, or at least who they thought He was. We'll see that in just a moment. So I think that a lot of these were the same temple police that had been sent before to capture Him. And so now we come and Judas has led them there. And so Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to Him, went out to them. He didn't wait for them to come to Him. He made the first move and He went out to them. Partly because I think we'll find in just a moment that He was trying to protect the disciples. Basically, the one you're looking for is me, let these other folks go. We'll hear that in just a moment. But Jesus went out to them. What that tells us is Jesus knew what was going to happen. We just read that in verse 4. He knew all that was about to happen. But what I want us to really understand is Jesus did this willingly. He didn't try to run. He didn't even try to hide. He went out to them. He knew this was the cup that God had placed Him on earth to bear. And He did so willingly. We need to never forget that Jesus went to that cross for us, and He did so out of love, willingly. So He went forward to them, and He asked them, "Who is it that you want?" He knew who they wanted, but He asked them, "Who is it that you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied, verse 5. "I am He," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. That's in parenthesis in the NIV, but it is very, the verb standing is a very vivid verb in the Greek language, meaning that this is the one. It's a stark contrast between the disciples and the traitor. And He is standing on the other side. This one that had walked with them for the last 3 years is now standing on the opposite side. And so when Jesus said this, verse 6, when He said, "I am He," they drew back and fell to the ground. Think about that for just a moment. These are soldiers carrying weapons. These are temple officials. And when they hear Jesus say, "I am He," they bow down. What is really needs to be understood here is the words "I am" are the same words in Greek, ego eimi. They're the same words that are translated from Hebrew when Moses steps up to the bush and says, "You're sending me into Egypt. Who do I say is sending me?" And God says, "I am. I am that I am." There is no more powerful statement, no greater description of God's ultimate authority and power than "I am." There isn't anybody else. I am. And so I think part of it, and scholars would agree, I think part of it is when Jesus used those words, "I am," He did so in a way that I don't think they had any misunderstanding of who they were dealing with. And they fell back and fell to the ground. And we think, well, how is it that they went ahead and arrested Him? Jesus knew this was going to happen. He allowed it to happen. He went to them. And so when Jesus said, "I am He," they drew back and fell to the ground. And again He asked them, "Who is it that you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am He. If you are looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so that the words He had spoken would be fulfilled. And these words we read and studied earlier in this gospel. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." And so Jesus went to them not only to show us that He was willing to undergo what was about to happen, but also to protect the disciples. And we know that some of those disciples fled after all of this happened. A couple followed Him, and we'll learn about that next time. But I just want us to understand that Jesus did this willingly. He knew what was about to happen. He knew all that was about to happen, and He went to them willingly. And then when He asked, "Who is it that you want?" and they said, "Jesus of Nazareth," He said, "I am He." He didn't try to hide. In fact, He made that very divine statement, "I am. I am He." So all of this happened, as we said in verse 9, that it would fulfill that statement that I have not lost one of those you gave me, talking about His disciples. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. And then John tells us in parenthesis, the servant's name was Malchus. Now, interesting idea here, interesting concept. The disciples did not carry weapons. We're told in Luke chapter 22 that the disciples only had 2 knives. And so Peter happened to have one, and in his normal abrasive way, kind of fly off the handle way, he jumped out and he's ready to fight. And he cut off the ear. Now, it's interesting too that here John gives us the name and Luke gives the name, but Matthew and Mark do not give the name of this servant whose ear was cut off. But we find here that it was the high priest's servant, Malchus. Now, the only reason I want to point this out, and it'll come really more, and I'll reference it back next time, but as we get into the next part of the chapter and Peter and another disciple who is not named follow Jesus and get into the outer court when He is being tried, scholars would suggest that John, the author of this gospel, was somehow friends, not best friends, but somehow acquainted with the high priest, with Caiaphas. And so if that is really the case, and that would give them access to that outer court where we find Peter and making his denials later in this chapter. But that may be why John would have known the name of the high priest's servant, and that being Malchus. And so just an interesting side note there that we find here who really was affected by Peter's attack. Jesus, verse 11, Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" He reprimands Peter and says, the word there is really sheath your sword. Put it back in the box. Put your sword away. This isn't how we're supposed to do this. This isn't God's plan. We're not going to fight. And rather, it's translated as a question, shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? But it's really more of a statement. Shall I not drink this cup? And it's written in such a way, specifically in the Greek language, that it assumes a positive answer. Yes, I have to drink this cup. And so Jesus is again teaching Peter that this isn't how this is supposed to go. What is happening is meant to happen. I have to go through this. This is the cup that God has given me to drink. Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander. So we find here that the commander was involved in this from the Roman side of it. And the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound Him. The word there in the Greek language talks about, or gives the idea of binding the hands behind the back, just as you would think. And brought Him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Annas had been the high priest previously. And one would think, and scholars would suggest, that Annas probably had a room in the house where Caiaphas was. And so they brought him first to Annas, and then from there they go to Caiaphas. So this was Caiaphas, who is the high priest. It was his father-in-law. So they bring him to Annas first. And then, verse 14, Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be a good idea if one man died for the people. And so John is reminding us that all of this really is God's plan. He used these religious leaders in an evil way, these evil people, to carry out His plan, which reminds us that God can use anybody to carry out His plan. But Caiaphas had been the one that had said it would be better for one person to die for the good of the many. And that's exactly what Jesus is about to do. And so I'm going to wrap up there, but just have this understanding that Jesus went willingly, and they started out with the religious side of things. They brought him to the Jewish leaders, to the high priest, the former high priest, and then to the high priest. And all of this is to live out God's plan, the cup that God had given Jesus to bear. So as we wrap up, as we close, I just want us to remember that Jesus did this willingly. This wasn't an easy thing. We know from the other gospel accounts that Jesus sweat drops of blood, agonizing over what He knew was about to happen. And He knew that in the midst of that His disciples would run away. That Peter, He even told Peter, "You're going to deny me 3 times before the rooster even crows." He knows all of that is coming. And ultimately, we'll see this when we get there, but ultimately He knows that at one point when He's on that cross, even God will have to turn His back because He cannot look on what is happening. That was what He was willing to do, to be completely abandoned, to pay the price for our sin. And He did it willingly. When they came after Him, He went to them. He met them because He willingly went to that cross for us. May we be willing to sacrifice ourselves in service back to Him. Let's pray together. Lord Jesus, we thank You for Your willingness to pay the price that we couldn't pay. Your willingness to go to that cross when we couldn't. Your willingness to endure all that You endured because You love us. May we never forget what You have done for us. And may that inspire us. May that spur us on to good works for Your glory. It's in Your name we pray it. Amen. Thanks for being with us tonight.